All right, welcome to our week 4 lecture where we're covering Hamlet, Acts 3 through 5. So subtitle here, to be or not to be, that is the humanistic, existentialist, nihilistic question. Okay, so last week I introduced the philosophical concept of epistemology, or the questions that we ask about what is it possible to know, how can we get knowledge, and how can we trust the knowledge that we have. And that's still a really important philosophical concept that I want you to keep in mind and keep engaging with as you finish reading this play. But the thing that makes Hamlet so brilliant, and the reason why it remains such an incredibly influential play, is that it engages with a host of really important philosophical questions beyond just epistemology. Some that weren't even very widely explored or developed until very recently, in the 19th and as late as the 20th century. So some of the big ones that we're going to talk about today and just get the briefest of overviews on are the philosophies of humanism, existentialism, and nihilism. Okay, so I'm not a philosophy major and not necessarily an expert on these philosophical concepts, but they do offer some very important and very interesting insights into how we can interpret this play and what's going on. And so it's useful to have just a basic understanding of these philosophies. So let's just do a brief overview. First, we have humanism. Okay, so humanism is a really broad philosophical concept that has meant multiple things throughout history. To maybe briefly summarize it would be to say it's a philosophy that believes in the essential goodness of man and man's agency and ability to progression. So humanism posits that man is a free agent. Basically, that man has the power to choose his destiny. So unlike, or maybe like what we talked about in Julius Caesar, where there was sort of that idea of fate, or the fates being in charge. It's written in the stars, or the omens have predicted. Which used to be a very common way of thinking about life, that fate was in charge. This newer humanist philosophy moved towards the idea that man is in control, and that man is an agent capable of making his own choices and determining his own destiny. So humanism also believes in this idea of progress. It's very important, this continual progress of man, that we're continually learning, evolving, and becoming better as a species. Now, this concept wasn't necessarily a defined and cohesive philosophy during the Renaissance. It's more of a title that we've applied to what they were thinking about and talking about during the Renaissance. So the seeds and the ideas of it were very much there. They were spreading and infiltrating. And these ideas are very much tied up with the rediscovery of the Greek and Roman philosophers and all that sort of ancient classical knowledge that was coming to light during the early Renaissance, and the vast developments in the arts and sciences that were happening during this time, the Protestant Reformation and the questioning of the church's authority, and sort of just this growing sense of the greatness of man, of man's potentially limitless ability to act and to learn and to grow and to progress. It's very much in contrast with that medieval reliance on religious authority and or customs to define a human's worth or destiny. So this time, it's very exciting and sort of filled with a lot of hope and optimism about man, and we're going to look at the ways that Hamlet both upholds this philosophy but also seems to really sort of be questioning these humanist ideals. Okay, existentialism. Now, this is a philosophical concept that really only gets defined in the 20th century. Let's see, it's Jean-Paul Sartre. I don't know if that's how you say his name, but he's sort of the big name in existentialism. And he's writing in like the 1930s and 40s, I think. But many people actually credit Kierkegaard, who was back in the early 19th century with first discussing some of these ideas. Still, it's a fairly new philosophical concept in the grand scheme of human history. And it's a branch of philosophy that explores the problem of human existence. So it sort of asks questions like, what does it mean to exist? What is the purpose of existence? How is man supposed to respond to existence, right? Unlike humanism, existentialism doesn't automatically assign man as inherently good, okay? So man is neither essentially good or essentially bad. Rather, it's man's choices that define a man as good or bad. So in that way, it is similar to humanism in that existentialism still definitely believes in man's agency, man's ability to choose and make choices for his life. And that's sort of maybe where existentialism lands as the purpose of life is to choose your actions and to choose the meaning of your life. And the idea of authenticity, of living an authentic life, is very important to existentialism. And I'm not sure that this idea of authenticity is one that I completely 100% grasp, but it might best be summarized by borrowing a phrase from Polonius in the play, to thine own self be true. That idea of being authentic to who you are, or who you want to be, maybe. Who you choose to be. Okay. That's a very, very brief overview of existentialism. Okay, now let's talk about our third philosophical concept, nihilism. All right. So this philosophy is closely related to existentialism, but I think it's considered fairly distinct, in that it explores similar questions, but comes to sort of more negative answers. So they're still asking questions about what does existence mean? What's the purpose of life? But in nihilism, it sort of posits that life is inherently meaningless and absurd, and that knowledge is sort of impossible to, that it's impossible to actually know something for certain. Maybe that truth is impossible. And then another important tenet of nihilism is that morality does not exist, or at least not in absolute terms. So this judgment of what is good and what is bad, there's no absolutes there. So this is kind of a depressing view of existence, or at least one that doesn't, make us all feel really good about being alive. So hopefully you can already see, just in those brief overviews, the many ways that Hamlet seems to be exploring all of the central questions in these philosophies. What is the meaning of life? What does it mean to exist? How life might be absurd and meaningless? How, what is the nature of man and his purpose? And so you can see how philosophers of the 19th and 20th century looked at Hamlet and were sort of amazed that Shakespeare seemed to have anticipated their questions and ideas with this play. In the very first scene where we meet Hamlet, Act 1, Scene 2, we get this whole soliloquy where he's basically musing on suicide. Oh, that this too sullied flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into dew. Oh, that the everlasting had not fixed his cannon 'gainst self-slaughter, right? So, like, Hamlet's contemplating suicide here. He goes on lamenting about how wearied the world seems, stale, flat, unprofitable, etc. And this is either, like, classic nihilism or depression, or both, right? So we're going to take a closer look at some of Hamlet's soliloquies and speeches from this week's reading, from Acts 3 through 5, and sort of dissect how they explore these questions. So the first speech we're going to look at, of course, and obviously, the famous "to be or not to be" speech that we get right at the beginning of Act 3, right in that first scene there. So this is without question the most famous speech in all of literature, and its popularity would make you think that it must be profoundly insightful, which, yes, but if you read this carefully, you see, and really think about what Hamlet's saying here, it's also profoundly discouraging and depressing. So, to be or not to be, that is the question. And yes, that is the question of existentialism, that is the question of nihilism, or just the question of depression and suicide. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them. So he's asking, what is the purpose of life? Or maybe purpose is the wrong word, because he's asking what's nobler. What is nobler? Is it nobler to fight or to suffer through life? Is it nobler to suffer through the slings and arrows of life? Or is it nobler to take up arms and sort of, end your life, to die, to sleep no more, and by a sleep to say we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. Death is to be wished for. Gosh, this is the speech we hold up as the greatest of all literature. Death is to be wished for. To die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub, for in that sleep of death what dreams may come, when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, must give us pause. So, what he's saying here is, here's the problem with killing yourself. Here's the problem with ending life, with ending all the suffering of life. We don't know what's on the other side of death. We don't know what dreams may come. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrongs, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy take? So all of those awful, horrible parts of life, right? Everything that we suffer in life. Who would suffer all of these things when we might just end it with a bare bodkin? A bare bodkin, that's the term back then for basically a dagger or a knife. So we could end it all by, taking the knife and killing ourselves. Who would bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life unless that dread of something after death? The undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns puzzles the will and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others we know not of. So what Hamlet's essentially saying here is that the only reason humanity lives and puts up with existence is because we would rather deal with the horrible knowns than face the fear of the unknown. And that's the only reason. That's the only reason we all don't go off and kill ourselves, is because we're more scared of death and the unknown of the other side than than we are of how horrible life is on this side. What I find interesting about that one statement, that the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns, well, I mean, it depends on how you think about it, but I don't know, seeing the ghost of his father, doesn't that count as a traveler who had returned from the other side, who gave insight into about what the other side is like? Hamlet seems to have forgotten that in this moment. Okay, thus conscience does make cowards, and thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pitch and moment with this regard their currents turn awry, and lose the name of action. So basically what he's saying there is this fear, this cowardliness of our conscience that scares us so much that we don't take the action of killing ourselves. My goodness, right? Like, this is nihilism if ever we've seen it, right? That life is meaningless, life is suffering, life is absurdity, and the only reason we don't all end our lives is because we are more scared of the unknown of death. And that is our greatest piece of literature in the English language. These reflections on death and suicide. So yeah, really positive, uplifting stuff here. Okay, let's move on to this speech, which covers 2 slides. We'll get to it. This speech is from the first scene in Act 4. So to give it context, Hamlet's been sent off to England. He's traveling to the seashore to get on a boat to go to England, and they run across Fortinbras's army. And so Hamlet sort of pauses and reflects on watching this army. How all occasions do inform against me and spur my dull revenge. What is a man if his chief good and market of his time be but to sleep and feed? A beast, no more. So this is sort of a famous line here. This is Hamlet engaging maybe with some of those humanist ideals of his time and rejecting them. Because remember, in humanism, man is good, man is great, the potential of man to progress is unlimited. But Hamlet here, what is man other than a beast that just sleeps and feeds? Man is no greater than the beast. So sort of questioning and undermining those humanist ideals. Sure, he that made us with such large discourse, looking before and after, gave us not that capability and godlike reason to fuss in us unused. Well, and maybe here he's actually upholding that humanism, saying that he who made us, the creator, essentially God, gave us reason, gave us large discourse, and did not mean for it to be wasted in us unused. Now, whether it be bestial oblivion or some craven scruple of thinking too precisely on the event, a thought which quartered hath but 1 part wisdom and ever 3 parts coward, I do not know. So what he's saying there is whether it's the beastly side of me, or whether it's some craven scruple of his conscience, or overthinking on the event, that overthinking has quartered his thoughts into 4 parts. Okay? 1 part of it may be wisdom, but 3 parts of it is cowardice. Hamlet's reflecting here on his inability to act. Okay? So we're 4 acts into the play, and in the very first act, the ghost tells him, your uncle murdered me. You must revenge me by killing my uncle. Well, so that's Hamlet's mission in this play, to kill his uncle, to revenge his father. But he doesn't do it. He doesn't do it in the first act. He doesn't do it in the second act. And at first, it's because he's uncertain whether he can trust the ghost or not, right? But then we get the third act where he stages that mousetrap play and sees the king's reaction and sort of convinces himself that, yes, the king is guilty. So he's convinced himself that the king is guilty, and yet he still does nothing. He does not act. He does not revenge his father. So that's what he's thinking about here right now, his inability to act. What has stopped him from acting, from taking that revenge against his father? Is it because he's more like a beast, or is it because he is a coward, beastly cowardice? So his thoughts quartered here. Maybe one part of it is wisdom. Maybe there's a small part of him that's withholding from action because it's wisdom, but he suspects that the greater part of his ability to enact is cowardness. He says, and yet I live to say these things to do. Still I have cause and strength and means to do it. So here we're getting sort of that humanist and existential philosophy that man is capable of action. Man is capable of choice in his actions. So why isn't Hamlet making use of his agency, of his ability to act? Examples gross as earth exhort me. Witness this army of such a mass and charge, led by a delicate and tender prince, whose spirit with divine ambition puffed, makes mouths at the invisible event, exposing what is mortal and unsure to all that fortune, death, and danger dare, even for an eggshell. So to re-paraphrase that, he's saying, look at this army before me that's led by Fortinbras, this delicate and tender prince, who is acting. Fortinbras is acting. He is leading his army, and he's doing stuff, and he's exposing all of these people to, fortune, death, danger, possibility of death, right? Over what? We don't need to go into the politics of what Fortinbras is doing, but Hamlet's essentially saying he's acting over an eggshell, over not much cause at all. But even though there's not much cause there, Fortinbras is still this man of action, one who is chosen and is moving forward in his actions. And Hamlet admires that. Rightly to be great is not to stir without great argument, but greatly to find coral in a straw when honor's at the stake. So he's both admiring Fortinbras and also critiquing him, saying that Fortinbras finding a coral in a straw. His honor's at stake, and he's arguing over a straw that the problem that Fortinbras is fighting over doesn't matter so much, and that he's risking his men and their lives over, like a really silly question of honor. So Hamlet is critiquing that, but at the same time, at least Fortinbras doing something, not just, sitting idly by like Hamlet seems to be. So he compares himself here. How stand I, then, that hath a father killed, a mother stained, excitements of my reason and my blood, and let all sleep? While to my shame I see the imminent death of 20,000 men, the army before him, that for a fantasy and trick of fame go to their graves like beds, fight for a plot, whereon the numbers cannot try the cause, which is not tomb enough and continent to hide the slain. So he's saying, Fortinbras has a straw-like quarrel, an eggshell quarrel. He's going to war over essentially nothing. But Hamlet's got all of these reasons to fight. A father killed, a mother stained, right? He's got so many reasons to fight. And yet he's doing nothing, whereas Fortinbras is leading 20,000 men to war over a fantasy and trick of fame. So Hamlet takes some resolution here after seeing Fortinbras being active. Oh, from this time forth, my thoughts be bloody or be nothing worth. So, this is real deep, and there's a lot to parse out here. But Hamlet's definitely reflecting on the ability of man to act and the reasons of man's actions. And he is critiquing Fortinbras' reasons for actions, but also deciding that he can no longer be a man of inaction, that he needs to act as well. But what are those actions? They will be, bloody actions or nothing worth. Actions of revenge. Okay. Let's take a look at one final moment, one final speech. This is the scene we get in Act 5. Okay, so Hamlet has maneuvered his way off the ship to England, made his way back to Denmark with Horatio. So they're coming back in, and they stumble across the grave diggers who are preparing Ophelia's grave. He doesn't know yet that it's Ophelia's grave, but so they're watching this grave digger. Now, what you have to understand is at the time, then, as is true now, cemetery space was at a premium. So when someone needed to be buried in the cemetery, they literally dug the grave over someone else's grave, and probably many people's graves. So this grave digger is digging the grave, and he's sort of digging up all the old bones of all the rotted corpses that have been buried there before, and sort of just tossing them up. And Hamlet, seeing these skulls that are being flung up out of the grave, and contemplating the people that they once were, and the lives that they must have lived. He says, this one must have been a lawyer, and he's sort of like fleshing out what lives they must have led. But then the gravedigger announces that one of the skulls is actually Yorick, a person, a real person, a named person that Hamlet knew. He was the court jester or the clown in his father's court when he was younger. So here's his speech. Alas, poor Yorick. So he's holding Yorick's skull. This is the really famous scene. This is why Hamlet is always portrayed with a skull. He's sitting there talking to Yorick's skull. Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him, Horatio, a fellow of infinite jest, of most excellent fancy. He hath bore me on his back 1,000 times, and now how abhorred in my imagination is it. My gorge rises at it. So he's thinking that when this skull was alive, when this was a flesh and blood man with life in him, how I did hay on his back. And now he's this decrepit, lifeless skull, and how abhorrent that idea is. My gorge rises at it. It makes me want to throw up. Here hung those lips that I have kissed, I know not how oft. Where be your jibes now, your gambols, your songs, your flashes of merriment that were wont to set a table on the roar? Not one now to mock your own grinning. Quite chapfallen. So this is maybe not the most profound speech ever, but this is definitely still Hamlet contemplating what it means to be alive, what it means, and the difference between life and death, and sort of wondering, what is the point of any of it? What is the point of any of that life, any of that that song, that merriment, when the end result is this death and decay, this dry, dusty death and decay? What is the point of any of anything about life? So those are sort of the existentialist, humanist questions that Hamlet's really fixated on throughout this whole play. And they are very, very interesting to think about in terms of how we read Hamlet's actions and his choices and sort of his mental state. Okay, so there's so much that I didn't get around to talking about. Oh, goodness, we didn't talk about Ophelia. We didn't talk about Gertrude. These are two of the most fascinating, interesting female characters in all of Shakespeare's works. We didn't talk about Laertes. We didn't talk about the actual revenge scene at the end. So many things that we can still talk about if you want to in our Zoom meeting. So if you found anything in this lecture interesting, go ahead and comment about it on the discussion board. But if you want to talk about the millions of other things we could talk about in this play, leave your comments, leave your questions, and we'll make sure that we talk about them in the Zoom meeting.